The letter was already open when Silas Conroy's horse crested the last ridge above the Garrison homestead, and by the time his boots touched the red Wyoming earth, he understood that some burdens were heavier than the rifle on his back and the saddlebag on his hip, because some burdens were made of words that could never be unsaid. It had started on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1883, which was the kind of morning that made a man feel like Wyoming was not punishing him for once. The sky above Clearwater Flats ran wide and blue in every direction, the kind of blue that painters in the East tried to replicate and always failed, and the cottonwood trees along the creek bottom had gone to gold the way they did every September, shivering in the small wind that moved off the mountains before the sun had fully climbed. Silas had been at the livery stable in the town of Harlow when old Chet Burgess, who ran the post office out of the back of his dry goods store, came shuffling across the street with his suspenders halfway up his shoulders and an envelope in his hand. "Conroy," Chet said. He had the voice of a man who had gargled gravel for 40 years. "You riding out toward the Garrison place this week?" Silas was tightening the cinch on his roan gelding, a horse he called Duke because the animal had an opinion about everything and refused to be hurried. He glanced over his shoulder. "Planned to go out near the Eastern Creek boundary." "Why?" "Got a letter here for Bessie Garrison. Come all the way from Kansas City." Chet held it out like it was something precious. "Been sitting 3 weeks already. Stage don't go that far out, and I can't get nobody else to ride it." Silas took the envelope. It was good paper, cream-colored and stiff, sealed with a wax stamp that had been broken and then pressed back together so poorly that it was barely holding. He turned it over and saw the name on the front in a careful, educated hand. Miss Elizabeth Garrison, Harlow, Wyoming Territory. The return address in the upper left corner said it was from a law office. Harlow and Wicker, attorneys at law, Kansas City, Missouri. "I'll carry it out to her," Silas said. He tucked the letter into his saddlebag without another thought. He had seen Bessie Garrison exactly 4 times in his 28 years of living, and each time had lodged itself somewhere in him like a splinter he could not quite reach. The first time was 3 years ago when he'd helped her father, Amos Garrison, pull a wagon out of a creek crossing gone bad. Bessie had been standing on the bank with her skirts muddy to the knee, directing the operation with a calm authority that had made every man present stand a little straighter. The second time was at the Founders' Day celebration in Harlow, where she had bid on a pie at the auction, and paid twice what anyone else offered because the woman who baked it was a widow who needed the money. The third time was at the general store when she had spoken to old Harris, the shopkeeper, about extending credit to the Navarro family, new settlers from Texas who were having a hard first winter, and had done it with such plain-spoken decency that Harris had agreed before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. The fourth time was at her father's funeral 6 months ago, where Silas had stood at the back of the gathering and watched her hold herself together with the kind of quiet dignity that broke your heart more than weeping would have. He had thought about her between those 4 occasions more than was reasonable for a man who had spoken perhaps 30 words to her in his life. He was not a man who talked about things like that. He was a working man, a ranch hand who had been saving toward his own spread for 4 years, a man who kept his feelings filed under practical concerns, and his wants filed under someday. He rode out of Harlow that morning with the letter in his bag and Bessie Garrison somewhere in the back of his mind where she had been living, uninvited and stubborn, for 3 years. He had been riding for 2 hours, moving through the canyon country that separated Harlow from the eastern flats, where the Garrison homestead sat against the base of a long limestone ridge, when Duke spooked sideways at a rabbit and the saddlebag's buckle came loose. Silas pulled up and stepped down to fix it, and when he lifted the flap to tuck everything back in order, the letter slid out and fell to the ground. He picked it up. The wax seal, already barely holding, pulled entirely free, and the letter opened in his hands. He told himself later that he hadn't intended to read it. He told himself he was only going to fold it back and make it presentable. But the first 3 lines were already visible, printed in that same careful legal hand, and those 3 lines were enough to stop the breath in his chest. He read the whole thing. It took him 2 minutes of standing beside his horse in the canyon shadow, and by the time he finished, something had changed in the world. The letter was from the attorneys representing the estate of one Richard Calloway of Kansas City, Missouri. Richard Calloway, it explained in precise legal language, had been the intended husband of Miss Elizabeth Garrison of Harlow, Wyoming Territory, with whom he had entered a formal written agreement of marriage pending his relocation west in the spring of 1883. The letter went on to inform Miss Garrison that Mr. Calloway had died of typhoid fever in August of 1883, before he could fulfill the terms of said agreement. It further informed her that Mr. Calloway, prior to his death, had made provisions in his estate for Miss Garrison in the amount of $40, which the firm was prepared to send by bank draft upon her written acknowledgment of this letter's receipt. The letter closed with the attorney's regrets and the formal language of legal condolence, which was the coldest kind of condolence a person could receive. Silas stood there in the canyon, and he understood several things at once. Bessie Garrison had been engaged to be married. She had been waiting, out here on the homestead her father had left her, for a man from Kansas City to come and be her husband, and that man was never coming because he was dead. She had been waiting 6 months since Amos Garrison's funeral, running that homestead alone, through the tail end of winter and all of summer, waiting for a life that had already ended before she knew it. He folded the letter back as carefully as he could. He pressed the seal down. It did not hold. He climbed back onto Duke and sat there a moment, looking down the canyon toward the pale open land where the Garrison place lay another hour's ride distant. He could not give her that letter. He knew it was irrational. He knew it was not his decision to make. The letter was not his to keep or his to withhold. Bessie Garrison had a right to know about the $40 and to acknowledge receipt so the bank draft could be sent. She had a right to know that Richard Calloway was dead, and she had a right to grieve him in whatever way she needed to grieve. These were all reasonable, logical truths, but he could not picture riding up to her door and handing her that envelope and watching her open it, and watching the life drain out of her eyes the way he had watched it almost drain at her father's graveside. He could not be the thing that broke her. He rode the rest of the way to the Garrison homestead with the letter in his saddlebag and a conversation in his head that he could not resolve, and when he came around the last bend in the trail and saw the place spread out before him in the afternoon light, his heart did something complicated and without his permission. The Garrison homestead was modest but well kept in a way that spoke of a person who cared about what they owned. The main house was a low log-and plank structure with a good roof and a covered porch that ran the length of the front wall. There was a proper barn, solid and square, and a kitchen garden that had been put up for the season, the bean poles stacked and the beds turned. There was a windmill that was running clean, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a woodpile that was stacked higher than necessary, which told Silas that whoever had built that woodpile had been working out some kind of feeling while they did it. Bessie Garrison was in the yard between the house and the barn, and she was doing something with a length of fence rail and a post hole digger, and she was clearly losing the argument with both of them. Silas pulled up at the gate and took off his hat. "Afternoon," he called. She straightened and looked at him. He had remembered her clearly, but seeing her again was different from remembering. She was 25 years old, dark-haired and straight-backed, with a face that was honest without being plain and eyes that were a particular shade of dark brown that seemed to hold whatever they looked at and examine it fully before letting it go. She had a smear of red dirt on her left cheekbone, and her hair was coming undone from its braid, and she looked at him the way she had looked at that creek crossing 3 years ago, like she was assessing exactly what she had to work with. "Silas Conroy," she said. Not a question. He was surprised she knew his name. He tried not to show it. "Yes, ma'am. I was riding out this direction and Chet Burgess at the post office asked me to carry something out to you. He reached for the saddlebag and his hand stopped on the buckle. The letter was inside. He let his hand fall. I also thought, that is, I noticed from the road that your south fence line is down in 2 places. I could fix that before I head back if you'd let me. Bessie Garrison looked at him steadily. That wasn't what you reached for, she said. He was quiet for a beat. Pardon. You reached for your saddlebag and then you stopped. You have something for me in there. She wiped her hands on the front of her work apron. And something is making you not hand it over. He got down from Duke slowly and looped the reins over the fence post. He looked at this woman who had just seen through him in 30 seconds flat, and he felt simultaneously admired and undone. I have a letter for you from Kansas City, he said. From a law office. Something moved through her face. It was brief and controlled, but it was unmistakably the movement of a person who has been bracing for a particular piece of news for a long time. From Harlow and Wicker, she said. You know them. I wrote to them twice, 3 months ago and 6 weeks ago. I never received a reply. She paused. Richard wrote to them before he fell ill. He was arranging things. He wanted to be sure everything was in order before he traveled. Another pause, smaller. He is not coming, is he? Silas stood at the fence post with her letter in his bag and the October light falling across the yard, and he said, No, ma'am, I am sorry to tell you he is not. She nodded once. It was the smallest and most controlled nod he had ever seen, and it cost her something to make it look that way. How long? She said. It was not quite a question. The letter says August. 2 months. She breathed through her nose. He has been gone 2 months and I have been. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Then she said, in a voice that was steady in the way that a dam is steady when the water behind it is high, You read the letter. The seal came loose on the trail. I should not have read it. I am sorry for that. But you did. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment, and the assessment in her eyes was different now. It had a different quality to it, something more careful and less guarded than he might have expected. You wrote an hour with that letter in your bag, and then you reached for it when you got here, and then you stopped. She said it like she was working out a sum. Because you did not want to be the one to hand it to me. He said nothing. He did not see the value in denying a true thing. She walked toward him, 3 steps through the red dirt of the yard, and held out her hand. Give me the letter, Mr. Conroy. He opened the saddlebag and gave it to her. She looked at the broken seal. She looked at him. She opened the letter and read it where she stood, with the afternoon sun on her face and the windmill turning behind her, and him standing at the fence post not knowing where to look except that he kept looking at her. When she finished, she folded it back along the original creases. She held it at her side. She looked out past the barn at the ridge that ran long and pale against the sky. $40, she said. Yes. He was a decent man, she said. He was not. We were not in love, Mr. Conroy. I want you to understand that, because I do not want you to think I am somehow less grieved by telling you that. We met twice in Kansas City before my father died. He was the brother of a woman I knew from school. He was kind and he was practical, and we had an arrangement that suited both of us. He needed a reason to go west, and I needed a reason not to be alone out here. She paused. I am grieved. He was a good man, and he died young and alone in a city, and that is a terrible thing. But I am not heartbroken in the way a woman is heartbroken when she has lost the person she loves. Silas did not know what to do with all of that. He said, Can I fix your south fence line? She looked at him like he had just said something unexpected and perhaps wonderful. Then slowly, something that was not quite a smile but was kin to one moved through her face. Yes, she said. You can fix my fence line. And then you can come in and eat supper, because it is getting late and I have more stew than I need, and I would rather not eat alone tonight if I can help it. He fixed the fence. It took an hour because the posts were rotten at the base in 2 places, and he had to go to her barn for the post hole digger and replacement timber, which she had stacked there with the practical foresight of a person who ran a property alone and knew things broke on their own schedule. She brought him water twice and stood for a while watching him work, and they talked, in the loose, careful way of people who are still figuring out the rules of talking to each other. about the property, and about the winter coming and about the state of the range, which was concerning because a dry summer had left the grass thin, and a lot of operations were going to feel it by January. "My neighbor to the north, Hector Ruiz, has a good water situation," she said. "He's been generous about sharing the creek access. He's been a good neighbor." "Ruiz runs Longhorns," Silas said. "He does. He offered to run some of his cattle on my south pasture through the winter, which would bring in a little income and keep the grass from going entirely to ruin." She handed him the mallet for the fence post. "It is a good arrangement, but I had to think about it for 2 weeks before I accepted it, because everything out here requires thinking about for 2 weeks before you can be sure it is not going to go sideways. Running a homestead alone will do that to a person," he said. "My father ran this place alone for 11 years after my mother passed," she said. "He managed it fine. I figure I can manage it too." She said it plainly, not defiantly, not seeking reassurance. She said it the way a person states a fact they have already made peace with. He finished the second post as the sun was starting to lower, and they walked back to the house through the cool early evening air, and she lit the lamp in the kitchen and fed the stove and ladled out stew from a pot that had been sitting all day and had gone to a deep, good richness. And she put out bread that she had baked 2 days ago and was still decent, and they sat across from each other at her small kitchen table and ate. It was the best meal Silas Conroy had eaten in he did not know how long, and it was not really about the stew. He told her about himself in the way you tell someone about yourself when you realize halfway through the telling that you want them to know. He told her he was 28 years old and had been working other people's ranches since he was 17. He told her he had saved enough to put a down payment on a section of land 12 miles west of Harlow, a place he had looked at twice but not yet purchased because he kept waiting to be sure. She asked him what he was waiting to be sure about, and he said he was not entirely certain, which was the most honest answer he could give. She told him about growing up on the homestead, about her mother who had died of influenza when Bessie was 14 and her father who had been the most stubborn and capable man she had ever known, and how losing him in the spring had been like having the floor pulled out from under a house she had been standing in her whole life. She told him about Kansas City, which she had visited twice and found bewildering in a way that made her love Wyoming more rather than less. She told him that she was 25 years old and had 3 chickens with names, and could hit a tin can at 40 yards with a rifle, and made the best apple preserves in Clearwater Flats, and that last item was not a boast but simply a verifiable truth. He believed all of it. When the supper was done and the dishes cleared, they sat for a while longer at the table with the lamp between them and the wind beginning to come off the mountains outside, and the conversation had shifted into something quieter and more comfortable, the kind of talking you do when you stop performing and start simply being present with another person. "Why didn't you hand me the letter when you rode up?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "Because I read it and I knew what it was going to do to you, and I could not bring myself to be the instrument of it." He looked at her. "That was not my choice to make. I know that. The letter was yours and the news was yours to receive, and I had no right to hold it back even for a moment. But on the ride over, all I could think was that I was carrying something that was going to hurt you, and I wanted to carry something different." She looked at him across the lamp. "What would you have carried instead?" "Something good," he said, "if I could have chosen." The wind moved against the house. The lamp flame shifted. Bessie Garrison looked at Silas Conroy in the way she had looked at him all evening, which was to say she looked at him fully, without deflection, as if she had decided he was worth the trouble of actually seeing. "You are a strange man, Silas Conroy," she said. "I have been told similar. I mean it as a compliment." She rose and carried the lamp to the windowsill and looked out at the dark yard. "Most men who come out here see a widow's spread and think about what they could take from it. You rode an hour with a letter that was going to break my heart, and then you could not give it to me, and then you fixed my fence." She turned from the window and looked at him. "Stay in the barn tonight." It is too late to ride back to Harlow, and the weather is changing. In the morning I will have coffee ready at first light." He said yes. He took Duke to the barn and settled him for the night with hay and water and a brushdown, and he made his bedroll in the clean hay of an empty stall and lay there in the dark listening to the wind move over the homestead. And he did not sleep for a long while because he was thinking about a woman at a kitchen table and a lamp between them and the way she had said strange as if it were the kindest word she knew. He was back for the winter. That was how he came to think of it later, though the actual process was more gradual and more sensible than that phrase made it sound. He rode back to Harlow the following morning as she had said he should, and he went about his work for the next week. And on the Saturday after his visit, he found himself thinking about the south pasture and whether Ruiz's cattle arrangement was going to hold through a hard winter. And he found himself thinking about the north side of her barn roof, which had looked like it might need new shingles before the snow came. And he found himself at Chet Burgess's store buying shingles and roofing nails and putting them in his wagon and riding east. She opened the door when she heard the wagon and stood on the porch with her arms crossed against the cold and looked at him and then looked at the wagon. "You brought shingles," she said. "Your north barn roof," he said. "The back corner before the snow." She was quiet for a moment, then she stepped back and held the door open. "Come have coffee first," she said. He came for the roof and stayed 3 days for various other repairs that presented themselves in the way that repairs always did on a property, one leading naturally to another. And he rode back to Harlow with the smell of her wood smoke in his jacket and the sound of her laugh, which he had heard twice, somewhere in his chest, where he was not entirely sure what to do with it. He came back 2 weeks after that because he had bought the land 12 miles west, and he wanted to tell someone, and the person he wanted to tell was her. She was at the kitchen table going over her accounts when he arrived, a ledger open before her and a look of focused concentration on her face that shifted into something warmer when she looked up and saw who it was. "I bought it," he said, standing in her doorway. She put her pen down. "The section west of town, 160 acres, good creek access on the north end, some timber on the high ridge, needs work." He was grinning in a way he did not entirely intend. "I do not know why I rode out here to tell you first. It seemed like the right direction to ride." She smiled at him slowly and completely, and it was the first time he had seen her smile that way, without any of the careful management she applied to most of her expressions. It was a whole and genuine smile, and it hit him somewhere between the ribs like a very gentle and very decisive hammer. "That is wonderful news," she said. "Truly. Sit down and tell me everything about it." He sat down and told her everything. She listened the way she listened to everything, fully and without interrupting, and she asked questions that were the right questions, about water rights and soil, and the condition of whatever existing structures were on the land. And by the time they had talked through the whole of it, the coffee was gone and the afternoon was well along. "You will need help," she said. "Building. I will hire hands when it gets to that point. Hector Ruiz knows everyone in this part of the territory. He can tell you who to hire and who to stay away from." She picked up her pen and tapped it against the table. "He is also very good at knowing which lumber suppliers are honest. I will talk to him." "I could introduce you," she said. "Properly. He knows who you are by reputation, but an introduction would help." She said it matter-of-factly as if it were simply a practical suggestion, but they both understood that she was offering him something, a thread of connection to her world, a place in the network of people and relationships that made up this part of Wyoming, and he accepted it with the gravity it deserved. "I would appreciate that," he said. They rode out to the Ruiz place 2 days later, and Hector Ruiz, who was a broad, weathered man of 50 with a genuine welcome and an excellent knowledge of the territory, shook Silas's hand and talked to him for an hour about land and cattle and the particular challenges of the section he had bought, and then poured them all a glass of something strong and toasted Silas's new beginning. His wife, Consolacion, who had come west from Sonora as a young woman, and had opinions about everything, and was almost always right, pulled Bessie aside in the kitchen, and Silas could hear them talking in a mix of Spanish and English that he could not follow. And then Consolacion laughed, and Bessie came back to the main room with a particular expression that was part amusement and part something more private. Riding back from the Ruiz place in the November cold, their horses walking side by side on the wide trail, she said, "Consolacion likes you. Good. She seems like someone worth being liked by. She is." A pause. "She also told me I was a fool if I let you keep riding out here every 2 weeks without telling you that I look forward to it." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Do you?" "Yes," she said simply. "I do." He reached across the space between their horses and found her gloved hand and held it. She did not pull away. They rode like that for a quarter-mile, not talking, with the mountains ahead of them going purple in the late light, and the whole of Wyoming spread out vast and cold and beautiful in every direction. And something settled into place between them that was better than words and did not need them. Winter came to Clearwater Flats in earnest at the end of November, and it came hard, the way Wyoming winters did, with 3 feet of snow in 4 days and temperatures that turned the creek to iron and cracked the wooden frames of windows if you did not keep the fires going. Silas spent most of the worst weeks at his own land, which had a small existing structure, a one-room soddy that was solid if dark, that he was using as a base while he began the long work of improvement. He had hired 2 men to help, brothers named Cal and Pete Hendricks from Harlow, who were experienced builders and honest workers, and they had managed to frame a proper cabin before the snow came down too thick for outdoor work. He rode to Bessie's place every 10 days through the winter. Sometimes the ride took twice as long as it should have because the trails were drifted, and once he had to shelter with Duke at a rock outcrop for 3 hours waiting out a ground blizzard before it was safe to go on. He always arrived with something, firewood if her woodpile was looking thin, or supplies from town, or once a book he had come across at the general store, a novel by Mr. Thomas Hardy that he thought she might enjoy, which she fell on with a gratitude that told him she had been lonelier for books than she had been willing to say. She read the entire Hardy novel in 4 days, and handed it back to him with a complete and definitive assessment of its literary merits and flaws that made him want to go find every book in Harlow and bring them to her one by one just to hear her talk about them. He told her that. They were at her kitchen table, as they usually were, with the stove going against the cold outside and the lamp lit against the early dark of December, and she gave him that direct look she had and said, "That is a very kind thing to say." "It is a very true thing to say." She looked at her hands on the table. "I have been thinking," she said. He waited. "About the spring," she said. "About what comes after the winter." She looked up. "I have been thinking about what I want the next part of my life to look like. I have been thinking about this homestead and your land 12 miles west and about—" She stopped. "I am going to say something that is possibly very forward, and I want you to know I have thought about it carefully, and I mean it as a serious proposition, not a reckless one." "Say it," he said. "I think we would be good together," she said. "In a lasting way. I think we already are when we are together. I think you have been thinking the same thing, and neither of us has said it plainly, because we are both careful people who take time with important decisions." She met his eyes steadily. "I am saying it plainly now. I think you should stay." The wind was moving against the house, and the stove ticked, and the lamp burned between them, and Silas looked at this woman who had decided to be brave and direct rather than cautious and quiet, and he felt the whole of the past 3 months settle into a single clear point. "I have been thinking the same thing," he said. "Since the first night, since the fence posts." She breathed out slowly, as if she had been holding more tension than she showed. "Then we are in agreement." "We are in agreement," he said. He reached across the table and she met him halfway, and they held hands across the Hardy novel and the lamp and the accounts ledger, and outside the Wyoming winter did its worst, and neither of them noticed it particularly. He proposed to her properly on a Sunday in February, with the snow still on the ground but the light already starting to carry the promise of something warmer ahead. He had ridden out the night before and stayed in the barn with Duke, and in the morning she had coffee ready as she always did, and after breakfast he asked her to come outside with him for a moment. She came out in her coat, and her breath misted in the cold air, and she looked at him with that measured expression that he had learned to love for its honesty. He did not have a ring, not yet, but he told her he intended to get one. He told her he wanted to build something with her, not just the land west of town, but an actual life, with all the difficulty and the work and the joy that entailed. He told her he had been in love with her since before he knew enough to call it that. He told her he thought she was the most capable and decent and genuinely good person he had ever known, and that those qualities in a person were rarer than any other quality he could name, and that he considered himself uncommonly fortunate to have been sent out from Harlow on a Tuesday in October with a letter he could not hand her. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ridge that ran behind the homestead, the one that in winter was white and in summer went to green and gold. "If you had handed me the letter when you first rode up," she said, "I would have read it and I would have been alone with it, and you would have ridden back to Harlow. And that would have been that." "Yes," he said. "Then I am glad the seal was broken," she said, and turned to him, and the smile she gave him was the complete and genuine one, the one without any management in it, and he thought it was the finest thing he had ever seen in his life. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is very much a yes," she said. They were married in Harlow on the first Saturday of April, 1884, when the snow was off the lower ground and the cottonwoods were budding, and the whole of Clearwater Flats smelled like cold water and new grass. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Alcott in the small white church that sat at the north end of Harlow's Main Street, and it was attended by half the town and all of the Ruiz family, and the Hendricks brothers and Chet Burgess, who wept openly and without apology. Bessie wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself over the winter, and she walked into that church with her chin up and her eyes clear, and Silas stood at the front and watched her come toward him, and thought that he had been given something he had not known to ask for, which was the best kind of gift. Consolacion Ruiz threw dried flower petals from her own garden, which she had saved from the summer before and kept in a cloth bag specifically for occasions like this. And Hector Ruiz made a speech afterward at the celebration in the Harlow saloon, which Clem the saloon-keeper had graciously closed to regular business for the afternoon. That was partly in Spanish and entirely from the heart, and everyone cheered at the end of it, including people who had not understood a word of it. They spent the first night of their marriage at Bessie's homestead, because it was the home they knew best, and because the cabin on Silas's land was not yet finished to the standard either of them wanted, and they sat on her porch in the April dark with a blanket over their shoulders and looked out at the ridge and the stars, and Silas thought about the Tuesday in October when he had ridden out with a letter he could not deliver, and he thought that the universe had a peculiar sense of construction, setting up its moments the way a good storyteller did, where the thing that seemed like misfortune was actually the pivot point on which everything better turned. "What are you thinking?" she asked. She had her head against his shoulder and she was looking at the stars. "I am thinking that I owe a great deal to bad wax," he said. She laughed, and it was the laugh he had been collecting all winter, the genuine one that surprised itself, and she pressed her face against his shoulder to muffle it, and he felt it through the cloth. Spring opened Wyoming like a hand spreading wide, green running up the hillsides and the creek running fast with snowmelt, and Silas and Bessie turned their attention to the land 12 miles west, which was going to be the center of their life together. They made the decision together, sitting at her kitchen table with a piece of paper between them, that they would keep the Garrison homestead running as a secondary operation for the first 2 years, which meant they would split their time between the two places and gradually shift the weight of their work west as the new cabin and the ranch structures improved. It was ambitious. It was the kind of plan that required both of them to work harder than they had been working, which was already considerable, but neither of them was the kind of person who was frightened by that. They hired Cal and Pete Hendricks full-time for the building season, and they hired a young man named Louis Reyes, who was 19 and had come north from New Mexico and was looking for steady work, and turned out to be one of the most naturally capable hands with cattle that Silas had ever seen. Louis was quiet and hardworking and a little homesick, and Bessie noticed the homesickness and began, over the spring and summer, to make small efforts about it, inviting him to eat with them in the evenings and making sure the Ruiz family knew he was there. And Consolacion Ruiz, who took in stray people the way other women took in stray cats, adopted him into the extended circle of the Ruiz household with a warmth that visibly eased something in the young man. Bessie was like that, Silas learned, in a way that went beyond what he had known of her before. She was like that the way certain landscape features were like that, where you saw the broad shape of it from a distance and thought you understood it, and then you got close and discovered all the specific detail that made it particular and astonishing. She was organized and fair and spoke plainly and held her word absolutely. She was funny in a way that was dry and exact. She read everything she could get her hands on and had opinions about all of it. She missed her father with a grief that lived quietly in her and surfaced sometimes in small ways, in the way she stood at the window on certain evenings, or the particular look on her face when she passed the field where Amos Garrison's wheat had grown. She was also stubborn in a way that sometimes drove Silas to the very edge of his patience, and then delighted him, because her stubbornness was never arbitrary. She was stubborn the way a good building was stubborn, because she had decided the right way to do something and had reasons, and the reasons were almost always sound. They argued in June about the kitchen layout in the new cabin. She wanted the stove on the east wall for the morning light. He had already put the framing in for the west wall because that was where the ventilation worked better. They had a proper argument about it, the kind where voices rose and neither of them gave ground easily, and in the end they found a solution that was better than either of their original positions, which Silas reflected was probably a metaphor for something, if he had been the kind of man who thought in metaphors. He preferred to think in practical terms, and say the practical conclusion was that two people who disagreed well were more useful to each other than two people who agreed easily. The cabin was finished by August. It was a proper structure by then, 2 main rooms and a loft and a good stone fireplace that Hector Ruiz helped lay because he had learned masonry from his father in Sonora, and a kitchen that had the stove where both of them had agreed it should go, and a porch that ran the south side and caught the afternoon light. They moved in on the last Sunday of August, and Cal Hendricks brought a bottle of whiskey and Pete brought a pie his wife had made, and the Ruiz family came with enough food for twice as many people, and Louis Reyes came with a carved wooden box he had made himself, a practical and beautiful thing with their initials worked into the lid, and Bessie received it with such genuine pleasure that the young man went red to the ears and pleased. And Consolacion caught Silas's eye across the room and smiled the smile of a woman who had seen exactly what she expected to see. That night, after everyone had gone and the new house was quiet, they stood on the south porch in the August dark and looked out at the land that was theirs, both of them too tired and too full of feeling to say anything for a while. "We built something," Bessie said finally. "We did," he said. "More than the house," she said. "Yes." He put his arm around her. "More than the house." She leaned into him, and they stood there together on their porch on their land on the last warm night of the summer of 1884, and somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called once and the night answered with its vast and particular silence, and the stars came out over Wyoming in their thousands, and Silas thought that he had ridden out on a Tuesday in October with a letter he could not deliver, and arrived at this. The fall of 1884 brought the Garrison homestead situation to a point where it needed a decision. Bessie's neighbor to the east, A man named Fowler, who had always wanted the acreage, made a fair offer to buy it, and they considered it carefully over the course of 2 weeks, going over the numbers and the practicalities, and ultimately decided to sell. The price was honest and the simplification was worth it. When the papers were signed at the Harlow Land office in October, Bessie signed her name and then held the pen for a moment afterward, looking at the document, and Silas stood beside her and put his hand on her back, just resting it there, and she turned and looked at him and nodded once. "Good," she said. "It's right." They put the money from the sale into improving the main spread, building a second bunkhouse for when they could afford to expand the crew, sinking a better well, and purchasing 12 head of good cattle that Hector Ruiz helped them select from a herd coming through from Colorado. They also set aside a portion of it that Bessie put in the bank in Harlow, because she had inherited her father's belief that a certain amount of anything should be kept in reserve against the day when reserve became necessary. Louis Reyes was still with them through the fall and into the next year, and had by then become something close to family, which was a designation that Bessie applied practically by ensuring he had proper winter gear, warm meals, and the hearty novel when she was done with it, which he read with the same concentrated attention he gave to everything. He wrote home to his mother in New Mexico and received letters back that Consolacion sometimes helped him translate the difficult portions of, and his homesickness had softened from something sharp to something more like a manageable distance. He also, in the way of young men who work alongside capable and kind women, had developed a visible admiration for a girl in Harlow named Florence Alcott, who was the Reverend's niece and had come out from Denver the previous summer to help with the Reverend's household, and had decided she preferred the territory to the city and stayed on. Florence Alcott was 20 years old and spirited and read as many books as Bessie did, which was the thing that connected them, because Bessie had begun lending her books and Florence had begun stopping by the ranch when she was in that part of the territory to return them and discuss them. It was through one of these book-returning visits that Florence met Louis Reyes, who was working in the corral when she arrived, and who tipped his hat to her with a directness that she received with a directness of her own, and they stood at the corral fence and talked for an hour about nothing in particular and everything at once, in the way of two young people who have just discovered someone they find genuinely interesting. Bessie told Silas about it over supper that evening with a satisfaction that was barely contained. Silas listened and said, "You are delighted." "I am extremely delighted," she said without apology. "You are matchmaking." "I am simply providing a hospitable environment in which two young people who are clearly suited to each other can spend time in each other's company," she said primly. "What they do with that environment is entirely their own decision." He laughed. He loved her so much it was sometimes startling. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was milder than the previous one, which was a mercy for everyone on the range, and they came through it in good shape. The cattle Ruiz had helped them select proved well chosen, hardy through the cold, and they added 4 calves in the spring, which Silas counted the morning he found them in the south pasture with the satisfied feeling of a man whose plans are working. In March of 1885, Bessie told him over the breakfast table without preamble that she was expecting a child. He looked at her across the coffee and the eggs and the morning light coming in the east window exactly where she had wanted the stove that made this possible, and he felt the kind of feeling that exists outside ordinary language, the kind that takes over the chest and behind the eyes and the hands, because his hands moved without his deciding to move them, and he reached across the table and covered hers. "When?" he said. His voice was not quite steady. "October, I think," she said. Her eyes were bright. "Possibly late September." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her carefully, which made her laugh because she pointed out that she was not breakable, and he said he knew that. He just wanted to hold her carefully for a moment, and she let him. They wrote to Consolacion Ruiz first because Consolacion would know what to do about everything and would have opinions about all of it, which proved correct. Consolacion arrived 2 days later with a list of practical items needed, a lot of advice, and a length of very fine cotton cloth for making small garments, and she sat with Bessie for an afternoon going through the knowledge that she had accumulated from raising 5 children of her own, and Bessie took notes with the same systematic attention she gave to everything important. The summer of 1885 was a good summer. The ranch was finding its shape. The cattle herd was healthy. Louis Reyes had by then been courting Florence Alcott for 5 months in the serious way of a young man who intended to mean it, and the South Range was green and well-watered from a wetter-than-usual spring. Silas built a room off the main cabin, small and well-lit, that would be the child's room. He built the furniture himself through the evenings of July and August, a crib and a small chest and a rocking chair, that last item being intended for Bessie, who received it with a look that made the whole summer's worth of evening work worth it 10 times over. The child came at the end of September, a few weeks earlier than Consolacion's reckoning, in the way of children who have their own schedules regardless of anyone else's plans. Consolacion was there, which was the critical thing, and the Harlow doctor who made the ride out in time, and Silas, who spent several hours in a state of profound helplessness that he managed by being as useful as possible in any direction, which mostly meant keeping the fire going and the water hot, and staying out of the direct way of Consolacion, who ran the proceedings with the confidence of long experience. It was a boy. He was a large and emphatic boy who announced himself to the world with a vigor that Silas, hearing it from the other side of the door, felt somewhere in his boots. The doctor came out first and told him it had gone well. Then Consolacion came out and pressed his arm and went to the kitchen to get something, because she was always going to the kitchen to get something because her expression of love was feeding people. Then the doctor said he could go in. Bessie was propped against the pillows with the boy in the crook of her arm, and she looked exhausted and extraordinary. The way he had thought about when she said careful things were not the same as weak things, and she looked up when he came in, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen before and would not forget for the rest of his life. "Come see him," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and dark-haired and had Bessie's direct gaze already, looking up at him with an expression that suggested he was assessing the situation and forming opinions. "Hello," Silas said to him. He felt completely inadequate to the moment and entirely adequate to it at the same time, which he understood was probably going to be the primary experience of fatherhood. "I want to call him Amos," Bessie said, "if you agree." He looked at her. He understood what that meant, carrying her father's name forward, making it live on in this room on this ranch in Wyoming in the future that Amos Garrison had worked himself into the ground to make possible. "Yes," he said, "I think that is exactly right." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Amos Conroy," she said quietly. "That is a good name." "It is a very good name," he said. Amos Conroy turned out to be a boy who had strong opinions from the beginning and a curiosity about the world that started with reaching for things and grew, over months, into a determined investigation of everything he could access, which, as he became mobile, proved to be considerably more than anyone anticipated. By the time he was pulling himself upright on the furniture, Bessie had reorganized the lower portions of every room in the cabin with the practical efficiency she brought to all challenges, and Silas had learned to check under the porch before he sat down, because the child had a liking for small, dark spaces. Louis Reyes and Florence Alcott were married in June of 1886 in the same Harlow church, where Silas and Bessie had been married 2 years earlier. And it was a wedding of the kind that a community makes happen together, with the Ruiz family providing food enough for the whole territory, and Bessie and Silas standing at the front as witnesses, and Chet Burgess weeping again, an old Reverend Alcott giving his niece away with a pride he was unable to conceal. And Florence, in a blue dress, looking at Lewis with the expression of a woman who has found exactly what she was looking for and knows it. Afterward, Silas stood with Hector Ruiz in the yard of the saloon, where the celebration had again turned Clem's business establishment into a community hall, and they watched their young people dancing in the afternoon light, Lewis and Florence and Bessie with baby Amos on her hip, and Ruiz said, "This is what we are building out here. You understand that, not just the land, this." "I understand it," Silas said. "My father came to Sonora from nothing. I came to Wyoming from Sonora from nothing. And now look," Ruiz gestured at the yard, the people, the town behind them, the mountains in the distance. "This is the whole story, right here." Silas looked at Bessie, who had handed Amos to Consolacion and was talking to Florence, both of them laughing about something, and the afternoon light was on her face, and she was 27 years old, and she was his wife, and she was the best decision he had ever stumbled into on the back of a horse with a letter he could not deliver. "Yes," he said to Ruiz, "this is the whole story." The years after that moved the way good years do, not uniformly smooth, but with a general forward motion that carried the weight of what had been built. There were hard seasons and easy seasons. There was a cattle disease in the fall of 1887 that moved through the eastern range and cost them 8 head before it was contained, which was a loss that hurt and that Bessie absorbed by going very quiet for 2 days, and then coming out of it with a reorganized plan for the herd that Silas adopted without argument, because it was better than anything he had thought of. There was a winter that was bitter enough to freeze the pump and crack 2 of the water barrels and have Lewis and Silas breaking ice from the creek in temperatures that did not bear describing, and there was a summer right after that was so good and green that the cattle put on weight in a way that almost made up for the hard winter. Amos Conroy grew through all of it with the straightforward determination of a child who has good examples to follow and a yard full of interesting things to investigate. He walked at 11 months, talked at 14, and at 2 years old was already following his father around the barn with a miniature version of concentration that made Silas feel a complicated pride. He had Bessie's directness and her habit of looking at a thing fully before deciding what to think about it, and he had Silas's patience, which manifested in a child as the ability to sit and observe something for a long time without needing to intervene in it. Bessie continued to read everything she could find and to share what she found with Florence Reyes, as Florence now was, and the 2 women developed a friendship that was conducted partly through book exchanges and partly through the practical sisterhood of women building lives in the same part of the world. Florence had a daughter, born in the spring of 1887, and Bessie was at the Reyes place when she arrived and came home that evening, with the particular bright-eyed expression of a woman who has spent a day around a new baby. She sat across from Silas at the kitchen table that evening in the same chairs where they had eaten supper on the first night he had stayed, the table that had moved from the Garrison homestead when they sold it and now lived in this kitchen, and she looked at him across the lamp with an expression he recognized. "Something to say?" he asked. "Amos is going to be 3 in September," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Yes," he said. "He should have someone," she said. "Eventually, when the time is right." "Are you telling me something specific about timing?" He said, because he had learned to navigate her careful statements over 3 years of marriage, and he was fairly certain this one had a specific meaning. She smiled. "I am telling you something specific about timing," she confirmed. He was around the table before she finished the sentence, which made her laugh again, the genuine whole laugh, and Amos, who had been asleep in his room, chose that moment to wake up and make known his displeasure at whatever had disrupted his sleep. And Silas went to get him and brought him back in his nightshirt, blinking and warm, and sat him on the table between them where he looked at both of them with his assessor's expression, and then reached for the biscuit tin. "You have very specific priorities," Silas told his son. Amos Conroy took a biscuit from the tin and ate it with great satisfaction. The second child came in the spring of 1888, which turned out to be the spring of a great deal of things. The cabin on the Conroy Ranch had by then been expanded, the original 2 rooms and a loft now grown into 4 proper rooms and a better kitchen, and a real porch with a rocking chair that got company more often than not. Louis Reyes had built his family's house on the south section of his own land, where he had filed his own claim in 1886, and the 2 operations were close enough to be genuinely neighborly and far enough apart to be genuinely independent, which was the right distance. The second child, born in April of 1888, was a girl. Silas was in the room this time, because Consolacion and Bessie had decided together that he should be, and it was an experience that left him simultaneously undone and more certain of everything he believed about what mattered in a life. The girl was smaller than Amos had been, quieter in her initial announcement, but with a particular attention in her eyes from the first moments that made Consolacion say she was one who would see everything. "Clara," Bessie said, when the doctor had gone and Consolacion was in the kitchen and Silas was sitting with her in the quiet of the room. "For my mother, is that all right?" "Clara," he said. "Yes, that is all right. That is more than all right." Clara Conroy grew into her name with a character that was distinct from her brothers from the beginning. Where Amos charged at the world, Clara watched it. Where Amos talked early and often, Clara observed for a long time and then said things that were startlingly complete. Where Amos followed Silas to the barn, Clara sat with Bessie in the kitchen and appeared to be absorbing the operation of everything through a kind of total attention that Silas thought, from the beginning, was going to make her formidable when she was grown. The Conroy Ranch by 1889 was a settled and productive thing. They had grown the herd carefully over the years to 50 head of good cattle, with Louis managing the South Range with the same natural ability he had always shown. Silas had added a proper cookhouse and a 3rd bunkhouse, and they employed 4 hands year-round now, including a young man named Thomas Bright who had come up from Colorado, and a seasoned older hand named Walt Greer who had been working the territory since before the railroad came through, and knew more about cattle than anyone Silas had met. Walt was also, it turned out, a man with a past that was more complicated than his steady manner suggested. He had worked for a large operation further east that had been involved in some of the range wars that had made that part of Wyoming ugly in the late 70s. And while Walt himself had kept his own hands clean, the experience had left him with a clear-eyed bitterness about certain kinds of men, the ones who used power and connection to take what wasn't theirs. He talked about it rarely but honestly when he did, and Silas listened and thought about the injustice of a territory that could be a place of genuine building for people like himself and Bessie, and the Ruiz family and Louis and Florence, and also simultaneously a place where large money could run smaller operations off land they had worked honestly if those operations were not careful and connected and stubborn. "You have to know your neighbors and your rights both," Walt told him one evening when they were checking the north fence line, and the conversation had drifted that direction. "The land office, the title documents, the water rights. All of it has to be clear and recorded and defended, because the day you need it is always the day you are least prepared for it." Silas took that seriously. He rode to Harlow the following week and spent an afternoon at the land office going through every document he had, and found 2 things that needed clarifying in the water rights language that the land agent helped him correct, and came home with a proper file of everything in order, which he showed to Bessie, who added it to the cabinet she had built for important papers and labeled the compartment with her careful handwriting. "Walt is right," she said when he told her about the conversation. "I have been thinking for 2 years that we should have an attorney in Harlow look at everything. Not because I think anything is wrong, but because knowing things are solid makes it easier to build on them." They hired a young attorney named David Park who had set up practice in Harlow the previous year, and who turned out to be thorough and honest. and who over the course of a month reviewed every document related to the Conroy Ranch and the original Garrison homestead transaction, and confirmed that everything was in good order, and also identified a small but real issue with the survey of the east boundary that he resolved with the land office before it could become a problem. Bessie paid him in cash and in a jar of apple preserves that had been promised as a bonus if he found anything worth finding. He accepted both with equal appreciation. The decade turned, and the world turned with it, and Clearwater Flats went on being itself, which was a hard and beautiful and particular kind of place. The railroad that had come through to the north of Harlow years earlier continued to change the shape of commerce, making it easier to move cattle to the eastern markets and easier to get supplies in. The town of Harlow itself had grown, not enormously but steadily, with a proper hotel now and a schoolhouse that had been there since 1886, and a doctor's office that was no longer dependent on the one doctor making rounds across 3 towns. Amos Conroy started school in the fall of 1891. At 6 years old, riding with Silas into Harlow on the school days and waiting for pickup in the afternoon, with a patience that was characteristic and a head full of questions that was also characteristic. He liked mathematics and disliked penmanship, and was devoted to a library of books about natural history that Bessie had accumulated for him. And he came home from school one October afternoon with a solemn expression, and told his parents that his teacher, Miss Drummond, had said that the Great Plains were once entirely covered by an inland sea, and that he needed to know whether this was true, and if so, why no one had mentioned it before. Silas looked at Bessie. Bessie looked at Amos with a consideration that the boy took very seriously. "It is true," she said, "and we have a book in the house that talks about it. After supper we will find it." Amos Conroy nodded with the gravity of a person receiving confirmed intelligence and went to wash his hands. "He is you," Silas said to Bessie. "He is both of us," she said, "which is why he is going to be absolutely unstoppable." Clara, at 3, watched her brother's departure and return from school with an attention that was recognizably jealousy in the direction of waiting, the desire to go and do and know that was being held temporarily by the fact of being 3. She dealt with it by attaching herself to her father with a completeness that Silas found simultaneously exhausting and the best thing that had ever happened to him. She rode in front of him on Duke's successor, a steadier brown mare named Pearl, when he made his slow rounds of the property, and she asked questions in the careful way she had, waiting for the full answer before asking the next one. She wanted to know why the grass was different colors in different places, and Silas told her what he knew about soil and water and sun. She wanted to know why the cattle stayed together, and he told her what he understood about herd behavior. She wanted to know why Walt Greer was sad sometimes even when he was smiling, and Silas held that question for a moment, and then said that sometimes people carried things from the past that were heavy, and that the way you helped them was by being consistent and kind and not making them carry anything more. Clara Conroy considered this on the back of Pearl for half a mile and then said, "So we should make sure Walt has enough pie." "That is," Silas said, "an excellent and practical conclusion." Bessie began, in the spring of 1892, to teach at the Harlow schoolhouse 1 day a week, which was an arrangement that Miss Drummond had proposed because Miss Drummond was, in Bessie's word, overwhelmed, which was an understatement for a woman managing 32 children in a single room with a limited library and the ambitious curriculum that Harlow's growing population required. Bessie's particular offering was the older children, the ones who were 12 and 13, and had moved through the basics and needed something more, and she went at it with the organized passion she brought to everything she cared about. Silas drove the family into Harlow on those days and spent the time at the land office or the feed merchant, or, increasingly, talking with David Park the attorney about the legal landscape of the territory, which was changing as Wyoming moved toward statehood, a process that had happened in 1890, and was still working its way through the practical implications. Wyoming had included women's suffrage in its state constitution, which was not something Silas had fully understood the significance of until Bessie explained it to him on the evening after the statehood was confirmed, and the expression on her face as she talked about it was one he had not seen before, something fiercer and more fundamental than her usual steady pride. "My mother never voted," she said. "My father voted in every election he could get to. And now," she looked at him across the table, "now I can vote for who governs the place I built." "Yes," he said. "That matters," she said. "It matters enormously," he said, and meant it. She voted in the first election. She was eligible to vote in the November of 1890, riding into Harlow with Silas, and standing in line at the polling place with the same straight-backed composure she brought to everything, and casting her ballot with the deliberate hand of a person who understood the weight of what they were doing. Consolacion Ruiz was in the same line, having also become a citizen through the years of residence that made that possible, and the two women walked out of the polling place together and looked at each other and did not say anything for a moment. And then Consolacion said something in Spanish that Bessie, who had been learning since she married into the neighborhood of the Ruiz family, understood enough of to know it was exactly right. The years of the early 1890s had their difficulties. A drought in the summer of 1893 burned the grass on the South Range, and they had to move cattle and renegotiate the grazing arrangements with Ruiz, who was generous about it as he always was. The national financial panic of that same year rippled out to Wyoming in reduced cattle prices that made the year's accounting tight. Bessie went over the books for 2 weeks and found every place to be careful, and they came through it without having to sell anything essential and without going into debt that was not manageable. Walt Greer retired in 1894, his joints having made sufficient objection to Wyoming winters that he decided to move to New Mexico, where Louis Reyes had family, a decision that was mourned on the Conroy Ranch and celebrated by Walt's knees. He left with a proper send-off and a genuine embrace from Bessie that seemed to mean a great deal to a man who had not always been in places where his well-being was someone's active concern. Amos, at 9 years old, gave Walt a drawing he had made of the North Pasture that was surprisingly accomplished for a 9-year-old, and which Walt folded into his breast pocket and kept there for the duration of the going-away gathering, and which no one mentioned directly because it would have made everyone involved cry in ways that were inconvenient. Thomas Bright became the head hand after Walt's departure, stepping into the role with a quiet competence that was not surprising to anyone who had watched him work. He was 24 by then, a steady and decent man who had been good for the operation in every year he had been part of it. Louis and Florence Reyes had 3 children by the mid-1890s, their daughter born in 1887, and then twin boys in 1891, who were currently the primary agents of chaos in the broader neighborhood. Their oldest, the girl they had named Pillar, was the same age as Clara Conroy, and the two of them had developed the kind of friendship that started with proximity and similar books and turned into something that would last a lifetime. The Conroy Ranch in 1895 was everything that Silas had imagined when he bought that 160 acres in the fall of 1883, and a great deal more. The herd had been expanded, and quality improved through careful selection. The buildings were solid and well-maintained. The water rights were clear, and the land documents were in perfect order in Bessie's cabinet. Louis Reyes's operation on the south section was its own successful thing, and the relationship between the two ranches was the kind of genuine partnership that made both stronger. But more than any of that, more than the cattle and the buildings and the carefully maintained documents and the productive land, the Conroy Ranch was a home in the fullest sense, which was the kind you built not out of timber and stone, but out of the accumulation of ordinary days. It was the supper table where Amos asked questions that required the better part of the evening to answer, and Clara said the precise thing that stopped everyone and made them look at her. It was the porch where Silas and Bessie sat in the evenings after the children were in bed and talked about everything and nothing, and where the silence between talking was as easy and full as the talking itself. It was the kitchen where Bessie's apple preserves were still the best in Clearwater Flats, and where Silas had learned over the years to make a decent biscuit and a very good venison stew. It was the barn where Duke's successor Pearl had now herself been succeeded by a young mare Amos had named Algebra for reasons that were his own, and where the particular smell of hay and horse and leather was as much home to Silas as anything the house contained. It was also the letter, tucked in the back of Bessie's cedar chest, the cream-colored envelope with the broken seal and the law office's careful handwriting, which she had kept all these years not as a wound but as a marker. She had shown it to him one evening in their second year of marriage, taking it out and unfolding it and reading it again in the lamplight, and he had asked her why she kept it. "Because it is where this started," she said. "You could not give it to me, and that was where this started." "I could not give it to you," he confirmed. "You were trying to protect me," she said. "From something you could not actually protect me from, because the news was true and I needed to know it. But the trying," she looked at the letter and then at him. "The trying was the beginning of everything." He took the letter from her and read it again, the legal language of loss and provision, the cold formal regret, and he thought about the man in Kansas City who had died of typhoid fever in August of 1883 without knowing what his dying would set in motion, 12 miles west in a Wyoming canyon, on a man on a horse who read an open letter and found he could not close it again. "What was he like?" Silas asked. "Calloway. Kind," she said. "Practical." He laughed easily. "He had good hands," she considered. "He would have been a good husband." "I hope I am a better one," Silas said. She looked at him, and the thing in her eyes was the thing that had been there since the fence posts and the stew and the first supper at her kitchen table, and it was the clearest and most certain thing he had ever been given. "You are," she said. "You are the best one, because you are the one who is here." He folded the letter back and she put it in the cedar chest, and they went on with the evening, which was ordinary and complete, which was the best kind of evening there was. Amos Conroy left for Laramie in the fall of 1899 to attend the University of Wyoming, which had been founded in 1886, and which he had been planning to attend since he was 14 years old with a solemn certainty that no one in his family had doubted. He studied natural history and geology and wrote letters home that were long and detailed and full of the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since he started asking questions at the kitchen table. The morning he left, Bessie stood on the porch and watched his wagon until it disappeared around the first bend, and Silas stood beside her and put his arm around her and felt the complexity of that moment, the pride and the loss that arrived together in the sending of a child into his own life. "He is ready," she said. "He has been ready for years," Silas said. "We have just been lucky enough to have him here while he was being ready." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Behind them, Clara, who was 11 now and had watched her brother's departure with an expression of profound assessment, came out onto the porch and stood on Silas's other side and took his hand. "Will he come back for Christmas?" she asked. "He will come back for Christmas," Silas said. "Good," Clara said, with the finality of a person closing a file. "Then let's go see if there is something that needs doing." There was always something that needed doing, which was the nature of a working ranch, and Clara Conroy approached that fact with the same practical energy her mother had, a straight-backed engagement with the immediate work that was its own kind of grace. Silas was 44 years old in the first year of the new century. He was gray at the temples, and his hands were the hands of a man who had spent 25 years working land, and he could still ride from dawn to dark without thinking about it, and still had no patience for dishonest people. And he was deeply and completely content in the way that only becomes possible when you have built something real with someone you genuinely love. Bessie was 41, and she was more herself than ever, which was to say she was more direct and more organized and funnier and more capable, and more beautiful to him than she had been when she was 25, and standing in her yard with red dirt on her cheekbone and a post-hole digger, she was losing an argument with. She had laugh lines now that he loved specifically and gray in her dark hair that made her look exactly like what she was, which was a woman who had lived her life fully and made something substantial of it. She was still teaching 1 day a week in Harlow, and had expanded her day to include an afternoon session for the older children that was now considered the most rigorous and valuable part of the school's offering. She had been twice requested to take a full-time position and had twice declined, because a full-time position would mean less time on the ranch, and the ranch was also hers, the land and the cattle and the particular satisfaction of a morning where everything worked, and she was not willing to give that up. Amos came home from Laramie for Christmas of 1899 with a young man named James Cotter, his closest friend at the university, and a man from the eastern part of the state who had, over the holiday, proceeded to be so thoroughly pleasant and thoughtful and genuinely interested in the workings of the ranch that Silas had found him good company, and Bessie had said afterward quietly that she liked him very much. What Bessie had also noticed, with the attention she brought to human situations, was the way Clara watched James Cotter, and the way James Cotter watched Clara, both of them doing it with the careful management of people who are not ready to name what they are feeling but have clearly felt it. She did not say this to Silas immediately. She filed it under things to watch. Clara was 11 and James Cotter was 20, and that was a distance that was entirely proper and entirely not the right moment for anything, except two young people being aware of each other in a way that would, over years, if it was meant to, turn into something else. Silas and Bessie sat on the porch on a January evening after Christmas, after Amos and James had headed back to Laramie, with the new century 2 weeks old and the cold sitting over the ranch in its usual January way, and Bessie told him what she had observed. He listened. He said, "She is 11. She is 11, Bessie agreed. And it is nothing but an awareness. It is nothing but two young people in a room who noticed each other. Years from now, if they are both still who they seem to be right now, it might be something, or it might be nothing. I am not matchmaking." He looked at her. "I am observing," she said. "There is a distinction." "There is a theoretical distinction," he said, "which in your hands becomes purely academic." She tried to suppress the smile and failed, and he loved her for it. The new century moved on, as centuries do, carrying everything forward into the accumulating shape of what had been built, and what was still being built, and what would be built by the people who came after. Amos graduated from the university in the spring of 1901, and came home with a degree in natural history, and an offer from a geological survey organization that wanted him in the field, which was exactly what he wanted, and which Bessie and Silas both understood was the shape of their son's life going forward. He was home for most of that summer before the survey work began in the fall, and he was present and fully himself, and the kitchen table conversations that summer were the best they had been in years, running late into the evenings with Amos asking the questions now and Silas and Bessie answering what they knew, and Clara, who was 13 and entirely formidable, contributing observations that stopped everyone and made them look at her with the expression her parents had been exchanging on her behalf since she was 2. James Cotter came for 2 weeks that August, because Amos invited him, and because the invitation was genuine, and because Clara, at 13, had grown into a version of herself that was clearer and more distinct than the 11-year-old James had met 2 years earlier. She was direct in a way that was specifically Bessie's and curious in a way that was both her parents'. And James Cotter, who was 22 and a serious and decent young man, treated her with exactly the respectful attention due a 13-year-old girl, and did nothing inappropriate in either direction, which was what a decent person did. Bessie noted all of this and continued to file it. The ranch ran well into the middle years of the decade. Clara took on more of the operation's work as she grew into her mid-teens, not because it was required of her, but because she wanted to, in the same way her mother had wanted to and her grandfather had before her. She had Silas's patience with the animals and Bessie's systematic approach to the business of the thing, and by the time she was 16, she could run the South Pasture operation from scheduling to accounting without supervision. Silas looked at his daughter doing that one afternoon and felt the specific pride that is not about what someone has done but about who they are. And he thought about a Tuesday in October 1883, and a letter he could not hand to a woman at a fence post, and everything that had grown from that moment like a tree from an improbable seed. Life had a way of building its best things out of the moments you could not manage, the seal that broke, the words you read that you could not unread, the ride toward a door you were afraid to knock on. You could not plan the pivot points. You could only be present for them and brave enough to stay when they arrived. Amos Conroy sent a letter home in the spring of 1904 to say that the Geological Survey had taken him to the Black Hills of South Dakota, and that he had met a woman named Margaret who was working as a schoolteacher in a small town near the survey camp, and that he was going to marry her in June if she would have him, which she had indicated she would. The letter was full of the restrained joy of a man who is very happy and is trying not to overstate it in case the reader thought he was being excessive, which was the most Amos Conroy thing Silas had ever read. Bessie read the letter twice and then folded it carefully and put it on the table and looked at Silas. "He is getting married," she said. "He is getting married," he said. "We should go," she said. "We should go," he said. They went to South Dakota in May of 1904, taking the train from Harlow, the first time Bessie had been on a train in 5 years, and they met Margaret, who was 26 and brown-eyed, and had a quality of calm intelligence that reminded Silas immediately of Bessie, though he was careful about saying that because Bessie would have said the comparison was both flattering and reductive, and she would have been right on both counts. What he did say was that he thought Margaret was exactly right for Amos, which was an assessment that Bessie confirmed without qualification, and that Consolacion Ruiz, when told in a letter, confirmed with 4 separate exclamation marks, which was the punctuation equivalent of considerable enthusiasm. The wedding was simple and right, and Amos Conroy looked at Margaret at the front of that small Dakota church, with the expression that Silas had felt on his own face on an April day in 1884, and Silas held Bessie's hand through the whole of it. Clara came with them on the Dakota trip, which was her first significant journey, and she was 17 years old and absorbing everything about the world she encountered in the systematic way she absorbed everything. She met the geologists in Amos's survey team and asked them specific questions about stratigraphy that several of them received with visible surprise and then genuine engagement. She met Margaret's family and made herself agreeable in the particular way of a person who is genuinely interested in other people rather than performing interest. And she met again James Cotter, who was 28 now and had joined the same survey organization as Amos, and who was present at the wedding as one of Amos's witnesses. James Cotter, at 28, was a man whose character had finished settling and was clearly good. He treated Clara with the same respectful attention he always had, and Clara, at 17, had grown into a woman who could meet that respectfulness with her own particular quality of direct and clear engagement. They talked at the wedding reception for a long time about geology and books in Wyoming and the shape of the West, and Bessie watched from the other side of the room with the expression of a woman who is not matchmaking. Silas stood beside her. He looked at his daughter and James Cotter talking by the reception table and then looked at his wife. "You have been right all along," he said. "I usually am," she said pleasantly. "About this specific thing." "About most things," she said, and he laughed and she laughed. And the wedding celebration moved on around them, and Amos and Margaret danced their first dance, and the evening was warm and full of everything good. Clara and James wrote letters to each other after the wedding, a correspondence that began politely and became, over the year following, something that was clearly more than polite. Clara was honest about it when her parents asked, in the direct way she had inherited, saying that she found him interesting, and that she thought he found her interesting, and that she was 17 and he was 28, and she was not yet ready to call it anything definite, but that she thought in a few years it might be definite. Bessie received this report with the face she made, when information confirmed a long-held hypothesis. Silas received it with the face he made when his daughter was clearly going to do whatever she was going to do, and was going to do it with full competence regardless of his opinion, and the right response was to trust her. She was, after all, Bessie Garrison's daughter. James Cotter came to the Conroy Ranch in the fall of 1906, when Clara was 19 and he was 30, and asked Silas for permission to court her properly with the intention of marriage when she decided she was ready. He asked with the straightforwardness of a man who respected the family and the family's daughter, and understood that she was the one who would make the decision. Silas said yes. He said it with the knowledge that this was the right man, and with the knowledge that his daughter, who was 19 and entirely formidable and the best combination of himself and Bessie that the world had produced, was the one who would make the decision in her own time. Clara made the decision in the spring of 1907, at 20 years old. She decided it the way she decided everything, after a period of careful observation and assessment and the application of her particular systematic intelligence, and she decided it was yes. They were married in the fall of 1907, in the Harlow church, and Hector Ruiz had died the year before from a long illness that he had borne with the same broad-shouldered dignity he had brought to everything. And so it was Consolacion alone who threw the dried flower petals and wept and embraced everyone. And Louis Reyes, who was 43 now and had laugh lines and gray at his temples, stood up as a witness alongside Amos Conroy, and Florence Reyes and their children were in the front pew. And Pilar, who was 20 years old and her parents' oldest and one of Clara's oldest friends, caught the small dried flower bunch that Consolacion had put together for the occasion and looked at it with an expression of pure delight. Chet Burgess was too old by then to be at the wedding, but he sent a card that arrived 3 days before the event and that said, in his scratchy hand, "I am glad Silas Conroy rode out that October. Give that man my regards." Bessie read the card and handed it to Silas and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Silas Conroy stood in the Harlow church in the fall of 1907 and watched his daughter marry a good man in the same church where he had married her mother 23 years before, and he held Bessie's hand the way he had held it at Amos's wedding, and he thought about the whole long thread of it, the Tuesday morning, the post office, the broken seal, the canyon ride, the fence posts, the stew, the lamp between them. He thought about a cream-colored envelope and the wax that did not hold. He thought about how he had reached for his saddlebag when he rode up to the Garrison place that October afternoon and had stopped, and she had seen him stop, and everything had begun there. He thought that a life was built out of so many things, out of work and weather and good neighbors and hard winters and apple preserves, and the courage to say what you meant clearly and the patience to hear what was said, and out of the small improbable moments when the thing that looked like failure or accident was actually the door to everything that mattered. Bessie leaned close to him as the vows were spoken. She put her mouth near his ear and said, quietly, "Do you remember that you could not hand me the letter?" "I remember," he said. "I am glad you couldn't," she said. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The ceremony ended, and Clara and James came back down the aisle together, and the Harlow church was full of the sound of celebration, and the October light came through the windows the way it always did in the fall, slanted and golden and specific to Wyoming. And outside on the main street of Harlow, the town was going about its Saturday the way it always did. The horses at the hitching posts, and the children running on the wooden sidewalks, and the mountains in the distance the same as they had always been. Enormous and indifferent and magnificent. Silas and Bessie walked out of the church into that light side by side, the way they had walked into and out of most things for 23 years, and she took his arm and they stood on the church steps in the October afternoon and watched their daughter and her husband receive the congratulations of everyone who loved them. "What comes next?" Bessie asked. He thought about it. He thought about the ranch and the cattle and the land, and Amos and Margaret up in the Black Hills with the surveys, and Louis and Florence and their children grown and growing, and Consolacion Ruiz still making her way through the world at 70 with the same warmth and opinion she had always had, and the cedar chest in the bedroom with the cream-colored envelope in the back of it, and the kitchen table that had started life in the Garrison homestead and now sat in the middle of everything he had built. He thought about winter coming and the fire they would keep burning and the mornings that would start the way they always did, with coffee and the particular quality of her presence across from him at that table, which was the thing he had never gotten so accustomed to that he stopped noticing it. "More of this," he said. "All of it." She looked up at him with those dark eyes that still held everything they looked at and examined it fully before letting it go. The eyes that had looked at him across a fence post and a broken seal on an October afternoon in 1883 and seen exactly what he was. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I want." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the two of them standing in the October light in the town of Harlow in the Wyoming territory that had become the state of Wyoming, and was still the same magnificent and difficult and beautiful place it had always been. And the celebration went on around them, and the mountains stood against the sky, and the whole of the life they had built together spread out in every direction, rich and real and entirely theirs. It had started with a letter he could not hand her. It had grown into everything worth having. And in the cedar chest, tucked carefully in the back behind the important documents and the small garments saved from the children's early years, the cream-colored envelope with its broken seal was still there, the way the beginning of a thing stays present in everything that comes after it, quiet and necessary, the seed you could not see for the tree.